In this episode of Making Stuff and Things, we're going to be building this Derelict ghost from the Destiny franchise. It's made of 3D printed parts and even has a lighting feature. The files are available to download from Thingiverse. We're going to be covering everything from the printing, cleanup, painting, weathering, and we are even going to get creative and add a bunch of battle damage. This is going to be a fun video. I know it was a lot of fun to make, so let's get to it. Alright, so before we get to building this thing, we gotta print it out. So let's open some files here. Now this thing's gonna include a little tea light inside of it to create that lighting effect. Now, depending on which ones you buy, they'll have a different number of nubbies. This one has 6. The tea lights that I bought have 8 nubbies. So let's go to open, and here actually we can see, here we have the 8 nubby one, which is called different light. So we're gonna make sure that we select this one. We're gonna select the black insert, the eye small, back body. The tips and the wings we will not be printing out on this round. In fact, the pins we won't be printing out at all, but we're gonna show you how we can make them later on in the video. So then we also want to select the wing set. Now with all those selected, we can hit open. I missed something here also. And the switch. There we go. So this ball loaded in upside down. This insert is standing upright. We don't want that. And this is upside down as well. We'll select them, go to the rotate option, and then select on this one where you can select a face that you want to be on the bottom basically. All right. And we just click on the bottom face and it will automatically align that to the bottom. So now we can select a different one, do the same thing, pop. So now we want to multiply our wing set. So we can click on it, right click, go to multiply selected, and we're going to set this number of copies to 1. And that'll just create a new copy. Now we also want to multiply this little insert for the wings. So we can right click on that, go to multiply selected, and we're going to create 3 copies. Now this is a mess, everything's chaos. So what we can do is select all models, swap, and arrange all models. And this will neatly arrange them. So now that we have this all put together, now we need to get into the settings. For the quality, we're going to layer height, and we're going to do 0.12. Let's see, infill, I have 8%. Now speed, I'm going to set this to 35. It's a slower speed, but not too slow. If you slow down your print, you're generally going to get better print quality. Supports, we're going to turn them on. I'm just going to do a normal support structure. Let's see, what do I do here? Yes, I have support interface and support floor checked on, but no roof. And last but not least, build plate adhesion. I'm just going to put a skirt on it. All right, so all you have to do then is hit slice and wait for it to slice. My God, that is slow. And after waiting for it to slice, we got 14 hours and 56 minutes, and you can save it to removable drive and put it into your printer, or however you get it from your computer to your printer. You can do it any way you want. All right, so those are the main pieces. So now that you printed them out, let's clear the build plate. And what we're going to do is just open up the tips. Now there's 2 different tips. There's tips and tips smaller. Now, this is just the nubby right here and the nubby right here. They're different sizes. That's the only difference. I'm just going to print out the normal tips. If you notice, these things are small, and I know myself. I tend to lose small parts and pieces. So what I'm going to do is actually multiply this by 1 and make 2 copies. For the print settings, nothing will change except for the speed. I'm going to set this all the way down to 25, and I'm going to turn off supports. We don't need them. All right, then you hit slice and then you're done. All right, now for hours of sanding. Yeah. The cleanup process is honestly pretty straightforward. I start off by snipping off the little happy feet that are included on the model for better bed adhesion. I just use flush cutters to get most of it. Next up, I lay down a big sheet of 150 grit sandpaper on the work surface and flat sand all of the bases. I then move on to a 220 grit. Some of the supports failed during the print, unfortunately, leaving goobers all over it. I took care of these easily with an X-Acto blade, no big deal. Next, we need to knock back those layer lines. I start off with 150 and then move to 220. This will be a common theme when sanding. By the way, this vise that I'm using, really helpful in this step. It frees up your hands and can be moved into more comfortable positions. Now that we have most of the layer lines taken care of, there are a lot of voids, or spots where no plastic was extruded. For this, I use acrylic spot putty. I grab a small amount with the blade of an X-Acto, and I spread it like butter on bread. The goal is to have a very thin layer, but you want to force it down into these voids to fill them. Let that dry completely, and then you sand it smooth with some 220 grit. Once all that is done, it's time for some Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 Sandable Filler Primer. I love this stuff. What it does is, as you sand it, it breaks down in smaller particulates that then fill in the gaps, to a certain extent. It can only do so much. Now, always wear a dust mask or respirator when using it. Seriously, this stuff is made to get into small spaces and fill them and stay there. Probably not great for the lungs. Now from here, what you basically do is just repeat all those steps until you get a nice smooth surface or a surface that you're happy with. So now we get to an experimental step. We're going to simulate some battle damage. This little friend has been around. It has seen some stuff. It's been beat up pretty badly. At least, that is the story I'm telling with this piece. I always like to create a story around the thing I'm making. I feel like it adds to it, makes it feel a part of the universe that it's from. For this step, I use a small butane torch. I never hold it down, but rather do short, controlled bursts. It doesn't take much. For now, I'm just trying to create some unevenness on the surface. I also never did any of the sides that hold magnets or need to be lined up on assembly. I do still need to fit this thing together when done. On some areas, I wanted a little more damage, like it was burned all the way through. For that, I held it a little longer in one spot. Then I used an X-Acto blade to tear a hole into its shell. You know, it's funny. Give me clay and tell me to sculpt an ear, and I can't do it. Apparently, I can sculpt a near perfect ear by accident in some melted plastic. Oh well. Anyway. Now, I want to make some pegs to hold this thing together. The STL files did include these, but they are so tiny that they would have been far more of a hassle to print than it's worth. For this, I'll use aluminum armature wire. It's a soft, pliable metal, but will be strong enough to work as pegs. I used 1/8 inch wire, but the holes are not that big. I whipped out my drill and made the holes wider. I was careful, eventually, as there isn't a lot of wiggle room. I almost drilled through the sides. Twice. After that, I cut them down to size and sanded down the sharp tip left by the cutters. I then used some CA glue to hold them in place. I made sure to only glue in one side because I still need to get it apart to change the batteries on the light at some point. I only did 3 pegs as it was already difficult enough to get both halves apart. 4, and it probably wouldn't come back apart without damaging the ghost in some way. We want to prevent that. Before painting, I did some assembly, mainly the tips of the horns and the inserts on the wings. I glued on the tips with CA glue, and the inserts, I just kinda stuffed them in there. They fit pretty well, and I didn't feel like they needed to be glued. I also glued in the eyepiece to the main body. I start off the base coats with a Paint Plus Primer Gloss Black. Once that is dry, I move on to Chrome Aluminum. From there I want to do a gloss clear coat. This is where I ran into my first major issue. See, different clear coats can react with certain parts. This reacted with the chrome and did some really interesting stuff. Now, normally I would be upset about this, but looking at it, the way it messed the chrome up, it actually looked neat. It dulled down the shine by a lot, and there were a lot of color variations. It was spotty. It actually looked more natural and suitable for the type of metal the ghost might be made out of. I let this dry overnight. Now, the reason for doing a metallic coat and then a clear coat before doing the main colors is that I'm going to be doing some paint chipping. The technique that I will be using is the hairspray method. The way this works, you want to coat all the parts in hairspray. I just used Aquanet. It's cheap and does the job. Hairspray is water soluble, which means it will break down once you add water. So the idea is to take your brush with some water on it and rub the edge of the piece or just wherever you want the chipping to take place. Eventually, the water will permeate through the paint and the hairspray, causing it to break down, revealing the metallic base coat. Before we do all that though, we need to get our main colors on there. Over in Photoshop, I made a mock-up of how I wanted it to look. This was actually the first time I did this on a project, but I'll definitely be doing this from now on. Blue with yellow stripes and accents. Sounds like a plan. So I did a coat of marigold yellow. Now once that is dry, I want to mask off all the parts I want to stay yellow. This is easily done with an X-Acto blade and some painter's tape. I laid out the tape on a cutting mat and cut it into strips and got to work on masking. It's pretty straightforward, but the more time and effort put in, the better the end result will be. The cleaner your lines will be. Take your time, put on some music or a podcast or whatever. Once everything is masked off, it's time for that final coat. I had to end up using a darker blue than I wanted, but this is fine. When that is dry, remove your masking to reveal, hopefully, some nice patterns and designs. For the centerpiece and the switch, I just did a dark metallic paint. Now, like I made a point to point out earlier, I used Paint Plus Primer spray paint. Very durable. So durable that water doesn't really break it down. So the paint chipping as planned just isn't going to happen. Not with water at least. I need something stronger. For this, Gamsol Mineral Spirits will do the trick. Now, it took a little while to get a handle on this. Basically, at this point, the whole hairspray trick was pointless. It was going to take a lot more than simply rubbing it with a soft brush. So I grabbed my special brush. It is a very stiff brush. So basically, I had a system. I had a clean cup of Gamsol, and in another cup, I had the Gamsol I would be using to clean the brush. I would dip the brush in the clean cup, hit the area I wanted to chip, and let that soak just a little bit. I also made sure to keep it contained. If it dripped somewhere I didn't want it, I would immediately wipe it off with a paper towel. When it's had some time to start breaking down the paint, I took the special brush and I really scrubbed at it. Now this was pretty difficult to balance between scrubbing hard enough to make it through our two main coats, but stopping before you start breaking through the metallic coat. Just keep going with this anywhere you want the chipping. Once satisfied with the results, I then painted the tips of the horns and inserts in the wings with a mixture of iridescent bright silver and Mars black. Once that dried, I gave it another coat of clear coat. This time I used a flat instead of glossy. Now I want to add some wires sticking out of the shell at some of the more damaged areas. I had to drill holes in order to get them in there. That's fine. Once I got the wires where I wanted, I cut them down to size and carefully, eventually, again, whoops, stripped a few millimeters off the tips. I then added a little more CA glue on the outside, let it drip down into the holes, then hit it with some CA kicker. Adding the magnets is pretty straightforward. For me, this was the first time utilizing magnets on a build. First step was removing paint from the spots where the magnets would be glued into place. I did this with the tip of a small Dremel bit. I also sanded the magnets with 220 grit sandpaper to give it some more tooth for the glue to grab onto. Once done, I dropped some CA glue in there and glued it in. I immediately wiped away any excess glue and hit it with kicker. Take your time with this step and make sure the polarities of the magnets are facing the right direction. You'll know if you did it wrong when the two pieces repel each other.
Whoops! Whoopsie!
My favorite part of any build is the weathering. To start off, I'm going to use some rub and buff on the core. A little goes a long way with rub and buff. Once it's on there, it's not coming off. Use very small amounts at a time and even wipe off most of it onto a paper towel. Now for the weathering paints. I usually use acrylics for this step, but this time I'm going to be using oils instead. The stuff I'm using is water mixable, so I can use water to thin it out. As far as the colors go, I use Naples Yellow Hue, Raw Umber, and a tiny bit of Ivory Black. As you can see, I made a muddy mix of colors on my little silicone pad. I add a bunch of water to really thin it out, then I just start spreading it all over, trying to be pretty random about it. The key to a good weathering job is color variation and avoiding creating actual patterns. I cover a good amount of space, then I wipe most of it off. The oils will not only leave behind some color, but kind of like a greasy residue. It's great for creating something dirty. It's still missing something. I need rust. I use raw sienna for this. One of the added benefits of using oils is that you can build up some texture with it. Perfect for rust. The only issue with oils is that they can take a long time to dry. This took about 2 days before I could put the final clear coat on. And for that, I used a flat clear coat. The final step is to create the lens that goes in between the eye and the light. It is included in the STL files, but I have no way of printing it out to be clear. Instead, I used 0.01 inch or 0.3 millimeter clear styrene. I scuffed up both sides with 220 grit sandpaper to add some diffusion. Then I just used CA glue to glue it into place. Now, normally I would say to never use CA glue on clear styrene because it will cloud it up. Well, it's already cloudy from the sandpaper, so it was fine. And so there it is. That's how I made a Derelict Ghost from Destiny. If you make your own, you know what? I would love to see the results. Post it to Instagram or Twitter and tag us in it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.